The return of the Boeing Starliner spacecraft to Earth without a crew might be one of the most pointless victories in space exploration history. Even though the Starliner smoothly separated from the space station and landed softly in New Mexico on Friday night, ending the 3-month test flight on a good note, it's still a bit disappointing. The 2-person crew remains stuck in space until next year. So, what does the end of this flight mean for Boeing and NASA? Is Boeing's frustration making NASA worry about losing its long-term partner, especially with the agency also dealing with big challenges with the Orion? We'll dive into all of this in today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. On September 6th, Starliner had a fairly calm trip back to Earth. The spacecraft began its return by leaving the docking port at the space station at 6:04 p.m. Eastern, a day after the astronauts sealed the hatch to get ready for departure. The capsule fired its thrusters to quickly move away from the station, getting ready for an orbit burn that would set Starliner on course for its landing site. Later, Starliner dropped its disposable service module to burn up over the Pacific Ocean, while the crew module, with an empty cockpit, headed for New Mexico. After gliding through the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean and New Mexico, Starliner deployed 3 large parachutes to slow down its fall, followed by 6 airbags inflating around the bottom to soften the landing. This was the 3rd time a Starliner capsule flew in space, and the 2nd time it didn't complete all of its goals. So, we're wondering if there are still problems with the Starliner despite its success. The return wasn't perfect. NASA said that one of the thrusters on the crew module malfunctioned during testing after the spacecraft left the space station. However, the system's backup ensured the faulty thruster didn't cause any issues. Besides this, 2 of the service module's thrusters overheated more than usual. NASA had intentionally turned off the fail-safe software to gather more data, so none of the thrusters failed like before. There are still some ongoing issues with Starliner. Now, NASA and Boeing will start looking into what went wrong with the spacecraft and decide if Boeing needs to change the design of the propulsion system, manage it differently to prevent overloading the thrusters, or do another test flight. Interestingly, NASA said it might still approve Starliner for regular crew missions even though it didn't bring Wilmore and Williams back. While NASA officials seem pretty upbeat, even celebrating Starliner's safe return, Boeing appeared somewhat detached from the result. 3 NASA managers, including Stitch, took questions from reporters during a press briefing on Saturday morning after Starliner landed. However, the 2 Boeing officials who were supposed to join the briefing canceled at the last minute. Boeing didn't explain their absence, and the company hasn't answered any official questions since NASA chose to end the Starliner test flight without the crew. It looks like Boeing is having a hard time accepting NASA's decision. Boeing has been eager to have astronauts aboard the Starliner, and they're very confident in Starliner's ability to bring astronauts safely back to Earth. This mission was supposed to be the last test before NASA could approve Starliner for regular missions. However, everything feels somewhat artificial and empty at this point. Meanwhile, Kelly Orberg, Boeing's new CEO, is considering whether to keep the company's space business. If Richard Abulafia, an aviation industry analyst at Aerodynamic Advisory, had his way, Orberg would sell it off quickly. "I would suggest selling their space business if possible," he said. Space travel isn't a core part of Boeing's operations, and it's been plagued with issues beyond just Starliner. One of the problems is the disconnect between company leadership and the workers actually handling the projects. The top executives don't grasp what's happening and seem uninterested in learning. The decision to let non-engineers run an engineering company without understanding the major technical challenges is creating significant problems. Boeing would take another reputational hit if they exited the space sector, but if they can't find a buyer, there doesn't seem to be a good reason to stay in. They are currently $45 billion in debt and need to focus on their main business outside of space. Boeing is also facing multiple public crises, from the ongoing issues with their 737s, linked to 2 fatal crashes that killed 346 people, to a door latch coming off mid-flight, and losing $1 billion on refitting Air Force One. The company has been involved in many scandals, and there's a real risk that the public is becoming desensitized to them. After all this, it's still unclear whether Boeing, with its current indifference, will pull out of the Starliner project. On one side, NASA officials are confident that Boeing will continue with the Commercial Crew Program. But it's odd that Boeing hasn't expressed the same confidence. A public statement from Boeing on the evening of September 7th didn't exactly sound like a firm commitment. I want to acknowledge the work of the Starliner teams and what they did to ensure a safe undocking, deorbit, re-entry, and landing, said Mark Nappy, VP and Program Manager of Boeing's Commercial Crew Program. We'll review the data and decide the next steps for the program. Truthfully, Boeing and NASA have worked together for decades, and only recently has their relationship hit a rough patch. Clearly, it's not NASA breaking up with Boeing. Starliner is still considered an important backup to SpaceX. NASA is determined to avoid a repeat of the 2011 to 2020 period when the U.S. had to rely on Russian spacecraft to reach the ISS after the Space Shuttle program was shut down. This means NASA is still very interested in Boeing continuing its current projects. While addressing the issues with Starliner is pretty noteworthy, the Orion spacecraft, designed to carry humans around the moon, is even more urgent with far greater consequences. Orion will carry 4 astronauts, and hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people are going to be watching humanity's first deep space mission in over 50 years. The issue concerns the safety of the heat shield located at the bottom of the capsule, which protects Orion's crew during return to Earth. Even during the Artemis 1 mission, which took Orion around the moon at the end of 2022 without astronauts, charred blocks of material cracked and peeled off Orion's heat shield during re-entry. After the spacecraft landed, engineers found over 100 areas where the re-entry pressures had damaged the heat shield. After evaluating the problem for more than a year, NASA convened an independent review team to conduct an analysis of NASA's work. The review was expected to be done by June, but discussions continued throughout the summer and have only recently wrapped up. The findings of the team have not yet been released, but essentially NASA faces 2 options with the heat shield. Either continue with the same heat shield that Orion used on Artemis 1 or redesign and build a new heat shield, which could delay Artemis 2 by several years from its scheduled launch in September next year. So far, NASA has not yet made a final call, but the situation is reminiscent of the indecision surrounding Starliner. The agency's responses have been very vague, saying things like a decision is still being made and everything is on track, but they are confident that the target launch date of September next year will be unaffected. Each of these choices is difficult. If NASA flies with the current heat shield, there could be opposition as seen with the Starliner deliberations, and the safety community has been encouraged to voice concerns. Similarly, some of the NASA safety community might express concerns about flying the current heat shield after unexpected damage on Artemis 1. At the same time, redesigning and rebuilding a heat shield would add years to the Artemis timeline, as well as delay Artemis 2 without a crew. Both decisions will be politically and financially challenging for NASA, especially at a time when Congress is more likely to cut their budget rather than increase it. Whatever NASA decides, don't expect the decision soon. No one wants to touch this political quagmire before the presidential election, and it could drag on into next year. On top of this, we can't ignore the SLEL's rocket that carries Orion and its massive launch tower, all of which are still facing delays due to technical issues and rising costs. As we've broken down in other videos, overall, NASA's problems keep piling up, and the agency certainly doesn't want Boeing walking away from any of their projects. Remember, Boeing will bear the financial burden of Starliner delays and losses, and if Boeing pulls out of the project now, NASA will have to take on the full consequences. That's all for today's episode. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.